In the heart of Congress, where every dollar means life or death, Mike Johnson thunders his plan to slash Medicaid, condemning 200,000 families to lose care in just 30 days. But Jasmine Crockett refuses to bow, igniting a firestorm that turns the chamber into a battlefield of survival and truth. Papers fly, voices clash, and power trembles under the weight of betrayal. When life itself becomes the currency, who will pay the ultimate price? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber lights burned hot against the polished wood, every seat filled with lawmakers who knew the stakes were nothing short of national paralysis. Mike Johnson leaned forward at the speaker's desk, his voice booming like a hammer on steel. "The American people cannot keep leeching off the budget," he declared, each word cutting through the silence. "Medicaid must be cut, and cut now." The words landed like a grenade rolling across the room, daring anyone to step into the blast. A hush followed, heavy and suffocating, as if the very walls of Congress were holding their breath. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat with sharp precision, her chair scraping against the marble floor in defiance. Her voice sliced through the still air. "That is not leeching. That is the right to live." Her eyes locked onto Johnson, unflinching, her presence a direct challenge to the throne he thought he owned. She didn't shout, but every syllable carried like thunder, electrifying the air around her. Lawmakers shifted uneasily, the tension crawling up their spines. The duel had been declared, and no one dared to interrupt. A pause followed, no rebuttals, no laughter, just heat. Every head turned. Lawmakers stared at the two like they were watching glass crack under pressure. A line had been crossed. No more politics, no more performance. What stood now wasn't a debate. It was a live grenade between two ideologies. And everyone knew this wasn't the climax. This was just the spark. Jasmine's last sentence still lingered in the space between them like smoke after a shot fired. But Mike Johnson didn't back down. No, he leaned in, slowly, his hands clasped in front of him like a man preparing for a kill. Then a crooked grin curled across his face. Not amusement, contempt. His voice came low at first, but soaked in venom. He let out a short, biting chuckle. "You're nothing but a cheap performance, Crockett," he snapped, eyes narrowing as if to size her up and rip her down in the same breath. A bleeding heart actress playing hero for the weak. The chamber tensed. The sting of his words wasn't subtle. It was designed to humiliate. You wouldn't recognize leadership if it sat in your lap, and you've never touched real economics in your life. The insult hit the room like a slap. Some Republicans smirked. Others shifted uncomfortably. Even staffers paused in their typing. The sound of papers rustling stopped. Jasmine stood still, her face unreadable. Johnson, emboldened by the silence, leaned back slightly like a man who believed he'd just won. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Instead, with terrifying calm, she reached down, pulled out a single sheet from her folder, and held it up between two fingers. It fluttered slightly under the AC vents, but her hand was steady. "This," she said, voice low, cutting, surgical, "is your problem." Every eye snapped toward her. Medicaid costs a fraction of what you hand out in tax breaks to billion-dollar corporations. 1/10, to be exact. She stepped forward, just one step, and locked eyes with Johnson like a scalpel finding its target. According to the Congressional Budget Office, Medicaid costs the federal government around $550 billion a year. But the tax breaks you protect for corporations, oil giants, hedge funds, pharmaceutical lobbies, easily surpass 5 times that amount. In some categories, Medicaid is 1/10 the cost. And yet here we are, punishing the people instead of the profiteers. The silence that followed was different now, charged, almost combustible. Johnson's eyes twitched. His smirk disappeared. And then it came, the moment he lost control. He slammed his palm against the desk with a force that shook his water glass. The sound bounced off the marble walls like a gunshot. "I don't need a lecture from a political outsider," he roared, the veins in his neck rising under his collar. "You don't belong at this table, and you sure as hell don't dictate fiscal policy." Some gasped, others recoiled. Aides dropped pens. The shift was undeniable. Johnson was unraveling. And Jasmine? Jasmine stepped forward, slow and sure, like someone who had just confirmed every suspicion she'd walked into that room with. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You're cutting from the people to feed the corporations," she said, her words cold as steel. Then she leaned in, just slightly. "If you want to talk about parasites, start with the ones you protect." Gasps erupted again. Real, raw, visceral. Lawmakers turned to one another in disbelief. What had begun as a policy debate had mutated into a public unmasking. Johnson stared at Jasmine like he'd just been slapped with facts sharp enough to bleed. No one moved. No one dared. This wasn't debate anymore. It was reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had just taken the first swing. The moment Jasmine's final words faded into the chamber's thick silence, she didn't wait for permission to escalate. She reached into her folder and pulled out another document. Thicker, heavier, stapled at the top like a packet meant for war, not review. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence did the lifting. Her fingers flipped the first page open with deliberate tension, revealing columns of names and dates. Real names, real diagnoses, real termination notices. She stepped forward, not with arrogance, but with purpose. "Here is a list of over 200,000 families," she said, holding the document above the podium like an indictment. 200,000. That's how many will lose access to health care within the next 30 days if your cuts go through. The weight of that number didn't hit the room like a figure. It hit like a funeral bell. Every lawmaker instinctively looked up. Some leaned forward. Others sat back, eyes darting to staffers for confirmation that what they were hearing was real. Jasmine didn't pause. She began reading. Names, states, conditions. Angela Mitchell, Detroit, 2 children. Dialysis ends in 12 days. Mark Gutierrez, Phoenix. Stage 3 cancer. Benefits terminated next week. The list went on, and on. Each name felt like a countdown, not a record. Jasmine's voice didn't shake. It sharpened. These aren't statistics. They're people. Single moms, diabetics, cancer patients, children with seizures. And every one of them has a name, an address, and a story that won't be covered once their care disappears. She stopped reading, but the silence stretched, thick and tense. A few eyes were red. A senior representative from Wisconsin removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. Jasmine stepped back, her gaze never leaving the man at the head of the chamber. "You want to talk numbers?" she said, voice steady as stone. "This is what your math adds up to. Suffering." That was the moment Johnson moved, slowly, deliberately. His jaw was tight, but his mouth curled slightly, not with concern, but with disdain. He placed both hands on the desk in front of him and leaned in as if daring the room to look away. Then, in a voice sharp as cold iron, he spoke. "They have to take responsibility for their lives," he said, gnarled with disapproval. "The government is not this nation's nursemaid." The blow didn't need volume. It needed only its sheer brutality. Time didn't move in the chamber. It stalled, suffocated. The oxygen seemed to vanish. Jasmine froze. So did the aides, the staffers, the entire front row of representatives, who now stared not at her, but at him. He hadn't spoken to the budget anymore. He had spoken to the country, and he'd called it weak. One congresswoman's hand dropped from her pen, landing against the table with a soft but telling thud. She shook her head slowly, as if something sacred had just been shattered. Another lawmaker muttered, "He didn't just say that," his voice barely audible but heavy as lead. Even Johnson's usual allies sat straighter, their faces unreadable now, not out of loyalty, but calculation. Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. Her hands gripped the packet of names, and for the first time they trembled. Not out of fear, but from something deeper. Rage, maybe, or heartbreak. Because what stood across from her wasn't just a political opponent. It was the embodiment of cruelty made casual. Johnson hadn't slipped up. He hadn't misspoken. He'd meant it, every word. And the room, every corner of it, felt that shift. Felt the coldness of a leader who saw humanity as liability. What had begun as a budget argument had now peeled its skin back to reveal something far uglier underneath. And Jasmine, still standing, was no longer just a congresswoman. She was now the only shield between that cruelty and the 200,000 names he just dismissed. The chamber had become a minefield. After the blast of Johnson's last remark, the room didn't breathe. Jasmine still stood in the eye of the storm, calm but radiating fire. Her silence was not retreat, it was the calm before retaliation. But Johnson, already unraveling, couldn't stand the loss of control. He wasn't just angry, he was threatened. The kind of threatened that made powerful men do stupid, dangerous things. He leaned over his desk, face flushed, voice ragged with fury. "Cut her microphone," he barked, his command slicing through the air like a blade. The sound system obeyed instantly. Jasmine's voice went dead mid-syllable. But he wasn't finished. He needed to bury her, to humiliate her. "Enough!" he roared. "This loudmouth woman doesn't belong in this chamber." The words reverberated across the floor like a riot baton hitting marble. The effect was instant and sickening. Heads snapped up. Several lawmakers turned visibly pale. One older congresswoman pressed her lips together, stunned. A staffer accidentally dropped a binder, the echo sounding like a crack of thunder. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't even glance down at the mic that had just been silenced, because her power didn't come from the sound. It came from something heavier. Without a word, she reached beneath her desk and slowly raised a thick folder into the air. Thicker than any budget bill, heavier than any talking point. Her hand held it high, as steady as steel. Inside, medical records, treatment schedules, disability ratings, and urgent appeals from America's forgotten. Veterans about to be cut off from the only care keeping them alive. She didn't need to explain what it was. Everyone in the room understood the moment they saw the Veterans Affairs seal on the cover. But it was her eyes that said everything. They burned across the chamber, locking on Johnson with a quiet fury that no microphone could carry, but no one could escape. No blink, no smile, no fear, just fire and grief, wrapped in control. Her silence said more than any filibuster ever could. "You can silence my mic, but you cannot silence the truth you fear most." The silence that followed was total, not respectful, paralyzed. You could hear a paperclip fall. No one reached for water. No one dared whisper. The entire room had become a courtroom, and Jasmine was holding the evidence. Johnson stood there across from her, red-faced, jaw clenched, his authority slipping by the second. And yet, instead of backing down, he doubled down. Because that's what cowards do when they see themselves exposed. His voice cracked, louder and more frantic. "Sit down, I said, sit down," he yelled, fists hitting the desk hard enough to shake his nameplate. The gavel lay untouched. The speaker was no longer in control. He was flailing. But Jasmine didn't move. She stood like a monument, folder in hand, voice stolen, but truth intact. In that stillness, she said more than he ever could. She didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. She didn't even look away. Because she didn't have to. The room had already chosen who to listen to, and her silence was deafening. The room had already felt heavy. But after Jasmine's silent defiance, after her raised folder and Johnson's loss of control, it no longer felt like a hearing. It felt like a slow collapse, a reckoning. Power, real power, had shifted, and Mike Johnson felt it slipping through his fingers like ash. The silence scorched him. The stares burned him. He needed to claw it back, fast. He didn't think. He lashed. Johnson straightened, face flushed and rigid. He leaned forward, gritting his teeth, and then exploded. "You are a disgrace," he shouted across the chamber, voice ragged, eyes wide. His words came like poison through clenched jaws. "A skin-color puppet who only knows how to cry for the weak." The chamber recoiled. Audible gasps rippled across both aisles, some of shock, some of horror. One congressman visibly winced. A young staffer sitting in the corner dropped their pen, the click echoing like a shot. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was an open wound, raw, racial, vicious. The mask was gone, and what stood behind it was something colder, crueler than anyone had prepared for. But Jasmine stood there, silent as ever. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Not even her expression shifted. She let his words hang and rot in the very air he'd just poisoned. She stared at him with a stillness more powerful than outrage. Then quietly, methodically, she stepped down from the microphone and walked toward a narrow side door near the edge of the chamber. No one knew what was behind it, but she did. She opened it without looking back. The door creaked open slowly, like it had been waiting for this moment all day. And from behind it stepped a man, not young, not healthy, not strong, but real. His name was Sergeant Harold M. Reeves, 68 years old, retired Marine Corps, 2 tours in Fallujah. Wrinkled fatigue jacket, Veterans Affairs issued orthopedic cane, a slow limp in every step. But it was the look in his eyes, tired, hollow, stripped of pride, that silenced the room more than any explosion ever could. In his hand, he held a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times and worn at the edges. He unfolded it slowly, like he was holding the last scrap of his dignity. It read, Department of Health and Human Services Notice of Medicaid Termination Recipient, Harold M. Reeves, effective. Date, June 1st. Dear Mr. Reeves, this notice is to inform you that your eligibility for Medicaid benefits will be terminated due to new federal budget restrictions. Your coverage for home oxygen therapy, pain management prescriptions, and post-traumatic injury care will cease on the above date. Please contact your state assistance office for any available alternatives. We appreciate your service. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Sergeant Reeves didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was the argument. Jasmine stood beside him, one hand gently resting on his shoulder, her other still holding the folder of files like a second weapon. They didn't need to explain what this was. Everyone in the room understood the moment they saw the Veterans Affairs seal on the letterhead. Johnson's face drained to stone, then flushed into a deep, blotchy red. He pointed at the man, desperate to swat away the truth standing before him. This is just a cheap stunt, he snapped. One staged exception dragged in here like a prop. His voice cracked under the weight of his own panic. A single outlier doesn't make your case. No one moved to agree with him. Not one nod, not one cheer. Just the creaking sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair, trying to put distance between themselves and the man who had just called a veteran's suffering a stunt. Jasmine turned slowly, her stare like fire behind glass. Her eyes locked with Johnson's, not with rage, but with something colder, certainty. She stepped forward once, placed herself directly in the center of the chamber, and let her words drop like a hammer. This exception, she said slow and measured, has millions of copies. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. And you will not bury them. A beat of silence, a pause that cracked open the truth. Sergeant Reeves was still standing, still holding that letter in his shaking hand, still looking like a man waiting for a country that had forgotten him to finally look back. And now it had. In that instant, every lie Johnson had thrown, every dismissal, every insult, every calculation, crumbled in full view of the chamber. This wasn't legislation anymore. This wasn't theater. This was a man who had given everything for the flag, now standing in front of its lawmakers, silently begging not to be erased. No one in that room could unsee it now, and Johnson knew it. His words may have echoed, but hers had landed, and in a chamber built for law, it was the truth that had just written its verdict. The moment felt suspended in time. Jasmine's words, and you will not bury them, still echoed like a final nail sealing something sacred shut. Sergeant Reeves remained standing beside her, his cane wobbling ever so slightly, that crumpled termination letter still gripped in his hand like a verdict. Across the chamber, no one moved. Not the staffers, not the aides, not the lawmakers, not even the guards by the door. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was paralysis. But Mike Johnson couldn't take it. He had been publicly undressed, stripped of control, of authority, of every layer of power he thought insulated him. And like any man exposed and furious, he did what cowards always do when the truth gets too loud. He tried to end it. This hearing is over, he suddenly roared, his voice sharp and cracked, like it couldn't decide whether to command or beg. He grabbed the gavel with a shaking hand, but instead of striking once with order, he slammed it repeatedly against the desk like a man trying to kill a snake. Guards, remove her from this room. Now! His voice exploded through the chamber. but no one moved. The guards didn't step forward. They froze, caught in the same stillness as everyone else. Because even they could tell, this wasn't protocol anymore. This wasn't politics. This was something else. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't look at the guards, didn't acknowledge the chaos behind the speaker's voice. Instead, she reached slowly to the folder under her arm, thicker now, heavier, as if it had absorbed the weight of every name inside it. Her hands moved with purpose, but not rage. Calm, calculated, devastating. She stepped forward, one stride, then two. She stopped in the exact center of the room, the heart of the chamber, right in front of the speaker's bench. Her gaze locked on Johnson, but she didn't speak. She let her hands do the talking. With a sudden snap of motion, Jasmine ripped open the folder and hurled its contents high into the air with both arms. What followed was not noise, but impact. 1,000 pages exploded above her like a paper storm. Termination letters, printed in black and white. Real names, real lives, real consequences. They spiraled, flipped, twisted through the air like snow caught in firelight. They floated down over the chamber like ash at a memorial. Some fluttered gently. Others fell hard, slapping the desks, scattering across the marble floor. The room gasped, but no one interrupted, because it was too much to process, too much to stop. The letters kept falling, and falling. Dozens landed on Johnson's desk. Some slid across the polished wood, curling at the edges. One sheet floated directly into his lap. Another struck the microphone, knocking it slightly to the side. His gavel vanished beneath the flood. Even his nameplate disappeared, buried beneath the paper truth he'd fought so hard to avoid. He didn't yell now. He didn't move. He just stood there, hollow-eyed, watching it all collapse around him. This avalanche of evidence, of people, of the very humanity he had tried to delete from the conversation. Jasmine remained perfectly still, arms at her sides, eyes burning through him without a word. She didn't need a microphone. The letter spoke loud enough. One final page drifted down more slowly than the rest, almost theatrically. It spun once, then twice, then settled directly on top of Johnson's outstretched palm as if the paper itself had chosen him. He stared at it, and for a moment his fingers twitched, but he didn't let go. The top line read, "Dear Ms. Patterson, due to recent federal adjustments to the Medicaid program, your benefits will end on June 1st. He read no further. The chamber had transformed. It wasn't a hearing room anymore. It was a graveyard of broken policies. The sound of fluttering pages was the only thing left in the air. That, and the cold understanding now creeping through the eyes of every person watching. Johnson wasn't leading anymore. He was drowning. Drowning in truth. Buried alive by the very people he thought he could erase with a budget line. No one rushed to help him. No one defended him. The power he once wielded so carelessly had just been stripped from him, sheet by sheet, in front of the entire nation. And the storm hadn't even touched Jasmine. The storm of letters had settled, but its wreckage still hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Jasmine stood amid the scattered cries of the forgotten. Paper cries, yes, but each one soaked in betrayal. Across from her, Mike Johnson clutched the desk's edge like a man gripping the last rung of a crumbling ladder. His mouth moved, but no words came. He was drowning, not in water, but in evidence. Somewhere in the chamber, a pen rolled off a table and clinked softly on the floor. That was the only sound. The weight of what had just happened had silenced even the staunchest defenders. The man who had bellowed just seconds ago, "The hearing is over! Guards, get her out!" now stood immobilized, eyes scanning the white paper storm that buried his authority like snowfall on a dying regime. And then Jasmine moved. Her body shifted forward, slow and composed, like someone approaching a gravestone. Not to mourn, but to reveal the name beneath it. Her hand dipped into her inside jacket pocket. This time she wasn't reaching for volume. She was reaching for the kill shot. A single page emerged. No theatrics, no raised voice. Just a document held flat between her fingers, thin, silent, and lethal. Its top read in bold red, "Confidential, internal use only." The seal of the Oversight Committee gleamed beneath the overhead lights, and at the very bottom, just barely visible from where Johnson stood, was something that made his knees subtly buckle. His own name. She walked directly to his desk and laid the paper down gently atop the pile of Medicaid cut notices. "This one," Jasmine said evenly, "has your name on it." A hush fell heavier than before. Johnson leaned forward. At first he didn't understand what he was reading, but as his eyes sped down the memo's lines, the blood in his face began to drain, his breath shallow and irregular. Effective upon budget revision, adjust Medicaid disbursement schedules to accommodate tiered reduction model in accordance with negotiated contribution benchmarks. Private sector incentives projected at $12.4 million. Target, major insurers, pharmaceutical consortiums, long-term care investors. Signed, Michael T. Johnson. The document didn't accuse him, it confirmed him. This wasn't an opinion. This wasn't an allegation. This was policy, crafted, signed, and delivered under his hand, prioritizing corporate payout over human need. Johnson's lips parted, but nothing came out. Finally, in a voice that sounded like it was borrowed from someone else, he stammered, That's not..." His words died before they could even become a lie. There was no oxygen left for spin. Every eye in the room turned to him. The committee members froze in place, as if afraid to move in the presence of something sacred or damning. Some shifted in their seats, but no one interrupted. They didn't need to. This was the kind of moment where silence does more damage than words. Even the guards, those same ones Johnson had barked orders to, stood still, unsure who they were protecting anymore. And Jasmine, she said nothing else. Her silence now spoke louder than any cross-examination. She had delivered the blade, and Johnson had walked into it. Across the chamber, a younger congresswoman whispered to her colleague, "He signed it. That's his signature." Her voice was shaking, not out of shock, but because she understood what had just happened. The man who once ruled this chamber with an iron gavel had just been overthrown by one page. His empire, carefully built on plausible deniability and selective compassion, had been pierced at its core. There was no rebuttal, no righteous fury, no procedural stall, only the sound of a man unraveling in full view of the Republic. And as the memo sat like a bombshell on the desk, with his name glowing at the bottom, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't a defeat, it was a reckoning. The weight of the last document still lingered in the chamber like a silent verdict. The memo, with Johnson's unmistakable signature authorizing the trade of Medicaid cuts for corporate insurance funding, lay flat on the oak desk, its presence louder than any gavel. Jasmine didn't need to speak again. She had already said enough. The paper spoke for itself, and now the room had to reckon with it. What had started as a hearing was now something else entirely, an unraveling. Johnson remained frozen, his fingers spread wide on the edge of the desk, trying to anchor himself in a reality that was slipping fast. His chest rose and fell unevenly, like a man who had just been pulled from a wreckage. But there was no fire here, only silence and eyes. So many eyes. Watching, judging, remembering. The face that once commanded applause had become a study in collapse, gray, damp, and gutted. Then came the shift, quiet, almost gentle, but it cut deeper than any shouted accusation. Congressman David Hale, once Johnson's most loyal ally, shifted in his seat. For years, Hale had backed Johnson through scandal and scrutiny, defending every policy with unwavering loyalty. But now, as his eyes met Jasmine's, something changed. His expression was neither ashamed nor angry. It was simply empty. He slowly stood, straightened his tie, and walked away from Johnson's bench without saying a word. Not a glance back, not even a pause. And like that, the dam cracked. More followed. Congresswoman Rachel Torres, who had once called Jasmine an opportunist with no grasp of federal priorities, quietly slid her chair back and stood. Her eyes avoided Johnson entirely. Instead, she fixed them on the stack of letters Jasmine had released earlier. The insurance termination notices, the names of the elderly, the disabled, the veterans. One by one, her fingers grazed the edge of the paper-strewn desk. She turned to walk toward the aisle, heels echoing like punctuation in the hollow room. Then came Congressman Drew Masters, the architect of the recent budget compromise Johnson had used to justify the Medicaid cuts. His hands, usually clenched and ready for debate, were now limp at his sides. He stood slowly, leaned in as if to whisper something to Johnson, but didn't. Instead, he glanced down at the damning memo and shook his head before stepping away, his footsteps deliberately slow, like a soldier leaving a fallen commander. Within seconds, the dominoes had fallen. Row by row, chair by chair, those who had once clapped for Johnson's iron grip now distanced themselves without speeches or apologies. They left behind their notes, their talking points, and whatever shred of defense they'd hoped to muster. They didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. The decision had been made. No one wanted to go down with a man holding a sinking ship. Across the room, something even more unexpected happened. A few members of the opposition, those who had sat in silence as Johnson thundered, mocked, and manipulated, stood up not to cheer, but to cross the floor. Slowly, cautiously, they moved toward Jasmine. There were no words, no grand gestures. Just presence. One placed a hand on the desk beside her, not to claim her side, but to acknowledge her truth. Another nodded at the stack of documents that had just torn through the illusion of invincibility Johnson wore like a crown. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She remained still, back straight, arms folded, eyes locked on Johnson, like a surgeon waiting for the final beat of a failing heart. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about drama. It was about exposure. One lie peeled back at a time, until the man left behind could no longer hide from himself. Johnson, once known for booming speeches and blinding confidence, sat like a man whose voice had been surgically removed. He didn't move. His body had shrunk somehow, shoulders hunched, chin lowered, hands trembling slightly as they hovered above the memo bearing his name. The same hands that had signed away protections for thousands now had nothing to grip but the consequences. His face, so often flushed with pride or fire, had drained to an ashen pallor. He wasn't crying, not yet, but his eyes had glazed over, as if searching for some back door that no longer existed. His breath came in uneven pulls, and for the first time, even his enemies pitied the silence. He looked not like a villain caught, but a man undone by his own choices, stripped not by scandal, but by exposure. The truth hadn't needed a megaphone. It had only needed a moment. One more moment passed, just long enough for Jasmine to reach down, retrieve the memo, and quietly slide it back into the folder. She didn't need to wave it. The damage had already landed. Johnson's eyes followed the paper like it was the last flame in a dark room. When it disappeared into her binder, something inside him seemed to vanish with it. He slowly lowered himself into his chair. No longer speaker, no longer lion, no longer feared. Just a man, small, defeated, hollow. His mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. The echo of abandoned footsteps still lingered in the chamber. The air, though still, felt heavy. He looked around the room, perhaps for an ally, perhaps for an escape, but there were none. And in that crushing stillness, Johnson sat alone, surrounded by chairs once filled with loyalty, now empty by choice. His power hadn't been taken. It had been walked away from. And that, more than any headline, any accusation, any shouted condemnation, was the most devastating loss of all. The chamber did not recover quickly. The silence after Johnson's collapse had settled like a storm cloud, thick and immovable, pressing down on everyone present. It wasn't just the humiliation of a single man anymore. It was the reckoning of an institution, a room where numbers, deals, and alliances had always seemed stronger than truth. Until tonight. What hung in the air now was something harder, heavier, the realization that a decision had to be made, not by words, not by theatrics, but by votes. The clerks moved first, their shoes clicking softly against the marble as they carried fresh sheets of tally lists to the chamber's leadership. The speaker pro tempore glanced once at Johnson, still slumped in his chair, pale and silent, before signaling the vote to begin. No speeches were offered, no procedural delays allowed. The room was already decided. They would test Johnson's strength the only way it could truly be tested, by counting. Whips moved quickly, heads bent together in hushed, urgent whispers. They scribbled notes, checked names, crossed out allies. The once solid wall of Johnson's majority now looked like a cracked dam, water rushing out faster than anyone could stop it. Even his most loyal lieutenants, the ones who had carried his banner in countless debates, were avoiding eye contact, staring down at their desks as if waiting for judgment to pass. The clerk called names, one after another, each syllable striking like a drum beat. Some lawmakers answered with voices steady and clear. Others hesitated, their eyes flicking to Jasmine before forcing the words out. Every aye or nay wasn't just procedure. It was a confession, a small piece of history added to the avalanche already bearing Johnson. And then the board lit up. At first, the numbers wavered close. For a heartbeat, Johnson's allies might have believed there was still hope, that fear, loyalty, or raw inertia might carry them through. But one by one, the lights shifted. Red after red blinked into green, names that had once been welded to Johnson's side, flipping under the weight of conscience or calculation, or both. It didn't matter why. What mattered was that they moved. The whip's pen stopped scratching. He looked up, shook his head. Even before the final count was read, the truth was written on the faces in the room. Johnson no longer had a majority. The speaker pro tempore raised the paper, voice even, almost clinical. The motion to advance the proposed budget cuts fails to carry. The measure is blocked. A ripple ran through the chamber. Not cheers, not applause, but something subtler and more devastating. Relief, shoulders unclenched, faces softened. Even those who had sat on the fence allowed themselves to exhale. The decision was final. Johnson's crusade against Medicaid was over. In the center of it all, Jasmine stood. She hadn't moved for minutes, her hands resting firmly on the binder and stuffed with letters and evidence, her gaze steady. Now she stepped forward, not toward Johnson, but toward the well of the chamber, the space where witnesses and warriors both found their voices. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't need theatrics. She simply let her voice carry. A budget isn't numbers, it's life. The words fell like stone on water, ripples spreading outward, striking every ear, every conscience. Her tone was calm but sharp enough to cut steel. She gestured toward the floor, still littered with the letters she had thrown. You trim a line, someone loses insulin. You move a decimal, a child loses chemo. Don't pretend it's balance sheets. Don't pretend it's abstract. Every page you saw tonight had a name, a body, a soul. That is the reality we are sworn to protect. Some lawmakers nodded slowly. Others bowed their heads. Even those who had opposed her before could not deny the blunt, undeniable truth. Medicaid was no longer a statistic. Jasmine had ripped it out of the spreadsheets and placed it directly in their hands, page after page, face after face. Her voice dropped lower, but every word carried. We can argue about numbers forever, but tonight we saw the line we cannot cross. Medicaid isn't charity, it isn't waste. It is the last thread holding millions of Americans above despair. Tear it, and you don't save money. You bury people. The silence after her words wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged, absolute. For the first time in years, the chamber was not divided into factions, parties, or caucuses. For a moment, it was just a room of human beings reminded of their duty. The line had been drawn, clear and unbreakable. The presiding chair cleared his throat, voice steady but softer now, as if even he felt the weight of Jasmine's words pressing down. It is the decision of this body that Medicaid shall remain as appropriated. Any attempt to reduce it below current levels shall not advance. There it was, the final verdict. No one cheered. No one clapped. But the effect was deeper than celebration. It was recognition, acknowledgement that something sacred had been preserved. A battle line had been drawn, not in ink, but in conscience. Medicaid, long treated as a bargaining chip, had been pulled out of the game. It was no longer negotiable. It was no longer expendable. It was life, and Congress had been forced to say so out loud. Johnson still hadn't moved. He sat slumped, staring at the desk where the memo with his signature had been laid bare, his hands trembling faintly in his lap. He wasn't looking at Jasmine. He wasn't looking at the board. He was looking at nothing, a man hollowed out by the collapse of his power. Around him, chairs had emptied, allies had walked away, and the air itself seemed to close in. The man who had once thundered about cutting parasites from the budget now sat alone, silenced by the very people he had dismissed. Jasmine, by contrast, stood taller than ever, not triumphant, not gloating, simply resolute. She had not won for herself. She had not even fought for a party. She had fought for the people whose names lay scattered across the chamber floor, and in this moment, they had won. The lights on the board dimmed, the clerk gathered the papers, and the chamber began to disperse. But no one forgot what had just been said, or what had just been stopped. Medicaid was no longer a line in a ledger. It was a line in the sand, and everyone knew it. The chamber was still humming with the weight of the vote when the room seemed to lean toward the center, as if the walls themselves wanted to hear what would come next. A hush moved through the floor like a tide pulling back from shore. Papers settled, chairs stilled, and the echo of clipped footsteps faded into a breath held by an entire body politic. No one spoke. Even the clerks paused with their pens midair. From the well of the house, Jasmine took one measured step forward. The moment found her before she reached for it. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't glance at the cameras or at the scoreboard that had just sealed the outcome. Her spine was straight, her eyes level, and the binder at her side hung like a tool, not a trophy. The floor lights sharpened along the edges of her suit, turning her into a cutout of purpose against the soft amber of the chamber. She drew a breath that sounded like resolve itself. When she spoke, she did not shout. She simply made truth travel. History will not remember us for what we cut, but for what we protect, she said, each word landing with clean precision, the kind that refuses dust and doubt. And today, we protect life. The words did not ring. They settled, heavy and exact, like a seal pressed to warm wax. Heads tilted toward her as if pulled, not by force but by gravity. The sentence was simple enough for anyone to repeat and too solid to break. It did not need ornament, it had consequence. Her eyes swept the floor, not to claim victory but to collect responsibility. She allowed the silence to stretch a heartbeat longer, letting the meaning sink past politics and down into something older than party lines. "You know what I mean," she continued, softer but sharper, the tone of someone who had worn the weight she described. "A budget line is not ink alone. It is oxygen in a plastic tank. It is a vial in a dark fridge waiting for a nurse at dawn. It is a number that either keeps a body standing or lets it fall." You could see the sentence strike. Small flinches, eyes closing, a thumb pressed hard into a knuckle. Jasmine did not gesture to the fallen letters, but their presence made a quiet chorus around her boots. She kept her gaze on the people, not the paper, because that was the point and always had been. "Some of us were taught to treat columns and rows like neutral ground," she said, calm and unyielding. "But there is no neutral ground when the result is pain that did not have to happen." The chamber listened the way a courtroom listens to the only voice that matters. Her cadence was courtroom steel and bedside mercy in the same breath. She let herself pause. One beat, two, so each soul could line up alongside its conscience. "If you ever forget what we sit here to do," she went on, her voice thinning to a blade, "look down at the nameplates on these desks, and then remember the names that never get plates at all." A few heads bowed, not in defeat, but in memory of someone who would have lived longer with one more refill, one more ride, one more month. "We are measured," she said, "not by how bravely we say no to the powerless, but by how faithfully we say yes to the fragile." It wasn't rhetoric, it was a ledger rewritten in human ink. She did not hurry. The room wouldn't have let her. "I've heard all the words for this cut," she continued, cool as winter light. "Efficiency, reform, discipline. I've used some of them myself when I didn't know better." A murmur of rare honesty trembled across the benches. "But tonight we stripped the paint and saw the wood. We saw what it really is when the decimal moves and the dosage stops. We saw the line where government ends and abandonment begins." The floorboards seemed to tighten under those last four words, as if the building itself disliked them. Her eyes drifted briefly to the public gallery, then returned to the floor. "I'm not asking you to carry a saint's burden," she said. "I'm asking you to carry your own oath." Another breath, steady and firm, and then she set the fulcrum with care. "We will argue tomorrow. We will clash and counter and bargain. But tonight we agreed on one thing we will not violate." The chamber leaned in again without meaning to. "We do not balance our pride on another person's breathing." It wasn't a flourish. It was a boundary. Her voice lowered and somehow it traveled farther. "History is a hard judge, but it has a simple rubric," she said. It asked whether the mighty protected what could not protect itself. You could feel the lines settle behind the eyes of people who had promised themselves they were practical, not cruel. We met that measure tonight, she added, and did not smile. We did not step back from the edge. We did not call mercy a loophole. We did not pretend that suffering earns its keep. The restraint in her tone made the praise feel like a summons, not a celebration. She shifted her weight, just enough to mark the turn. There are other lines to draw, she said almost to herself. There always will be. Then the note of iron returned. But this one stays. The last two words landed like a deadbolt sliding into place. Nothing in her face asked for permission. Nothing in her stance asked for forgiveness. She had already given both to the right parties. She let the room breathe and then gave it one last stitch to hold. Write it down however you want in the record, she said. Dispute the framing. Deny the motives. Draft your statements. A faint rustle of paper answered her, reflex without argument. But when you go home and someone asks you what we did here, she finished, the edge of warmth finally touching steel, use plain words. Silence waited for the words it knew were coming, the ones already etched into the air. Tell them we protected life. It was not a tagline. It was a verdict. And then she stopped. Not because she ran out of words, but because she had said the only ones that mattered. The quiet that followed was not awkward. It was ceremonial, the way a sanctuary quiets after a final prayer. No one rushed to fill it because nothing else could stand beside it. The chamber seemed to settle into itself, like a joint finding the right socket after a long dislocation. Even the overhead lights felt less harsh, as if the room had exhaled with her. Jasmine turned one page in her binder with a thumb and closed it, not with triumph, but with completion. She returned the clasp with a small metallic click that sounded louder than it should have. In another world, applause might have tried to force its way in. Here, no one risked breaking the shape of the moment. Respect does not always clap. Sometimes it simply stands still and lets the weight remain undisturbed. That was what this silence did. It honored the line. She did not look toward Johnson as she stepped back to her spot in the well. She didn't need to. The speech had not been spoken to him. It had been spoken past him, to the duty he could not meet. Her shoes found the exact prints they had left on the carpet earlier in the night, as if to say nothing had shifted under her feet except what should have. She placed the binder at her side, palms open, and let the last of the chamber's noise ebb out. Her expression held no victory. It held custody. At the rostrum, the clerk stood with a hand on the ledger, waiting for an instruction that did not come. The presiding chair glanced down at the papers stacked like dunes, then up at the scoreboards, then finally at Jasmine, as if to borrow steadiness. Somewhere in the back row, a pen rolled and stopped against a heel. The room had not so much calmed as it had aligned. When the chair cleared his throat, the sound seemed smaller than the quiet that followed it. Only then did anyone look back toward Johnson. He had not lifted his head during the speech, and he did not lift it now. His shoulders had rounded. The angle of his elbows made a small shelter around the space where his pride used to sit. The gavel lay near his right hand, but his fingers did not reach for it. He stared at the grain in the wood as if it could tell him where the ground had gone. The lights caught along his temple and slid away without catching on anything like defiance. There was no defense left in him, and he knew it. The set of his mouth had lost the hard line that once cut across cameras and crowds. The tension that used to armor his jaw had drained away, leaving the skin loose and the muscles trembling with tiny, unwilled flinches. If there were words forming inside him, they found no exit. None were wanted. None would help. The chamber did not demand his apology. It had already accepted his absence. He lowered his chin a fraction more, and the gesture did more than any speech he could have offered. It acknowledged without saying that the center had moved and would not be returning to him. It admitted the arithmetic he could not outrun. It conceded that the story of the night would not include a comeback, only a conclusion. The man who once tried to make people smaller with words now seemed smaller without any. It was a reduction not of height, but of claim. Around him, chairs remained filled, bodies still, eyes steady. There was no rush to adjourn. There was no scramble to capture the last word. The last word had already been spoken by the person who had earned it. It sat in the air above the flags and below the dome, as sure as a cornerstone. He bowed his head as if to pass beneath it. No one moved to lift him. No one needed to. The moment was not punitive. It was precise. Jasmine did not change her posture or her breath when she saw him fold. Her task was not to witness his fall, but to hold the line she had named. The chamber, for once, understood the difference. It let the two truths sit side by side, the preservation of life, the end of swagger, without forcing a scene to resolve faster than it should. The story would go on tomorrow, but not here, not now. Tonight had found its final frame. The light shifted minutely as someone adjusted the sconces, and dust motes drifted like slow confetti in the upper reaches of the hall. The sounds that remained were small and human, a throat clearing, fabric shifting, breath entering and leaving lungs that policies had the power to protect. No one asked for more words. No one needed a summation. The language had done its work, the vote had sealed it, and the posture at the rostrum had confessed the rest. In that exact balance the chamber held. Jasmine kept her gaze forward and her hands steady, as if guarding a door that had finally been closed. Her declaration did not blur with time. It sharpened as the seconds passed, engraving itself into the wood and the memory of the place. History will not remember us for what we cut, but for what we protect. And today, we protect life. The line rose again in the minds of those who had heard it, a tide that would return whenever the moon of crisis dragged it back. It did not demand applause. It demanded adherence. Johnson's head remained bowed, a single, simple answer to the night he had tried to master and had instead endured. There was no counterstroke, no final attempt to reclaim control by force of voice. He seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that authority is not a shout but a trust, and trusts are either kept or they are not. He had lost the room long before he lowered his gaze. Lowering it only made the fact visible. The chamber, in its stillness, granted him exactly what he had left, nothing to resist and nothing to wield. And so the scene held. One figure standing with the line drawn and named, one figure seated with the lesson accepted, the rest of the room suspended between them like a bridge that would hold only because the anchors were now true. No one hurried to the exits. No one tried to rewrite the moment with noise. The action was complete where it stood. Jasmine's words carved into the evening, Johnson's silence sealing them in place. The chamber's silence did not close the story. It opened the meaning, like a door that only swings once and stays wide. In that stillness, everything the night had shown sat in plain view. Paper on wood, breath in lungs, power humbled by proof. The lesson didn't come with trumpets or headlines. It arrived the way truth usually does, walking in on quiet feet and refusing to leave. What matters now isn't who won the argument, but what the argument revealed. The scene turned the lights on and left them on. This is where the message lives. First, the budget was unmasked for what it truly is, a moral document, not a math sheet. Numbers can look clean while outcomes bleed, and that is the trick that power loves to play. The night shattered that trick by forcing the room to look at names instead of columns. A budget isn't numbers, it's life. That line isn't a slogan. It is a measuring rod pressed against every decision that claims to be practical. If the math ends in unnecessary pain, the math is wrong. Second, the story made a demand that cannot be negotiated away. People are not line items. The letters that fell like snow weren't props. They were passports back into reality. Each page said, "This one breath matters," and said it so loudly that silence became an admission. The message is simple enough to survive any spin. Dehumanization is the first cut, and it happens on paper before it happens in bodies. The antidote is naming, seeing, counting correctly. You cannot fix what you refuse to see. Third, the night taught that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is strategy and steel. A cut microphone did not shrink the truth. It made the truth stand up on its own legs. When words are blocked, evidence can speak, and sometimes it speaks louder. The moral is not that yelling wins. It's that clarity wins. Raise your proof, hold your ground, and let the room feel the weight. Authority can command volume, but it cannot counterfeit reality. Fourth, courage is contagious, but it starts lonely. One person's stand redrew the room's posture one spine at a time. The lesson here is not mystical, it is procedural and human. Integrity begets alignment, and alignment shifts power even before votes are cast. You cannot plan the moment when a room decides to stop pretending. You can only be ready for it by standing where the line belongs before anyone else does. Fifth, power that relies on contempt is already cracking, even when it looks solid. The contempt in the language, cold, dismissive, demeaning, revealed a deeper belief that some lives are expendable. The lesson lands hard. Contempt is not a governing philosophy, it is an admission of moral bankruptcy. It may win a headline, but it cannot survive an audit. When contempt meets evidence, it buckles. When contempt meets conscience, it collapses. Sixth, proof is the great equalizer. In a world trained to worship spin, a signed memo is a liturgy of facts. Paper can be a weapon or a shield. Tonight it was both, and it cut through the armor of pretense. The human lesson is ancient, but newly urgent. Receipts matter. Documentation is dignity for the powerless and liability for the powerful. If you intend to harm, the ink will testify. Seventh, empathy is not a softness that policy cannot afford. It is the guardrail that keeps policy from driving off a cliff. We talk about compassion as if it were a luxury, something to sprinkle on top of the real work. The Knight corrected that lie by placing compassion at the foundation. Protect life is not a plea, it is a requirement. If governance forgets the faces, it forgets its purpose. And once purpose is lost, every decision becomes noise. Eighth, the veteran's letter carried a second message beneath its immediate plea. Service deserves reciprocity, not rhetoric. A country that asks for sacrifice must budget for gratitude, not just ceremonies. The cane, the limp, the paper, none of these are metaphors. They are bills past due. The lesson is not sentimental, it is contractual. If the nation keeps the medals and cuts the medicine, the ceremony turns into a mask. Unmasking hurts, but it heals more than it harms. Ninth, institutions are not cold machines. They are rooms full of choices that can still bend toward right. The tally, quiet, clinical, final, prove that conscience can outvote fear. The message isn't that politics suddenly became pure, it's that politics is still permeable to proof. You can shift a system by making the cost of denial heavier than the cost of courage. Tonight, weight did the work. That is a lesson citizens can use. 10th, leadership is custody, not theater. The person at the microphone did not deliver a performance. She delivered an oath back to its owner. The message here is that leadership cannot be measured by volume or swagger or the cruelty it can afford. It is measured by the lives it refuses to sacrifice for convenience. We do not balance our pride on another person's breathing. Keep that as a line in your pocket. Use it when the room gets loud again. 11th, language is a battlefield and precision wins. Words like efficiency, reform, and discipline can be sharpened into blades that cut the wrong throats. The Knight demanded that we pull those words back to their rightful meanings. Efficiency is not starving the sick. Reform is not erasing the poor. Discipline is not punishing the fragile. The moral is not to ban strong words, but to make them earn their keep. Say what is true and make it fit the facts like a lock fits its key. 12th, accountability is not vengeance. It is repair. The collapse of swagger at the rostrum was not a spectacle for the sake of spectacle. It was the necessary ending to a pattern that could not be allowed to repeat. The lesson is that accountability keeps the boundary bright so the next debate starts on solid ground. Without it, every argument returns to the same rut. With it, even the losing side learns where the road ends. 13th, history will not remember us for what we cut, but for what we protect. And today, we protect life. Treat that as more than a line. Treat it as a calibration tool. Use it on budgets, but also on schools, on streets, on the first hour in an ER, and the last hour in a hospice. Use it when the spreadsheet looks clean, but your gut knots. Use it when you're told a loss is necessary without being shown why. If the protection shrinks and the cut grows, the story is lying to you. 14th, the story teaches that dignity scales from the smallest gesture to the largest vote. A folder raised, a letter opened, a head bowed. These are not cinematic flourishes. They are the hinges on which history turns. The message is to treat small acts like they matter because they do. Culture is a million quiet agreements. Change is 1,000 quiet refusals. Don't wait for a headline to make yours count. 15th, the lesson isn't that conflict is avoidable. It's that conflict can be honest. The night did not end the fight over money, priorities, or ideology. It ended the pretense that those fights can be waged without faces on the line. The new rule is simple. Argue hard, but argue in the presence of the people your argument will touch. If your case shrinks in their shadow, your case is not ready. If it grows, you might be on the right road. And so the story's message stands where the night left it, clear as glass, hard as granite, and warm as breath. Power bends when proof stands up. Policy heals when people are not erased. History favors those who guard the fragile without asking for applause. The chamber will fill again, the boards will light again, and the numbers will try to look innocent again. That is how the world repeats itself. Let the lesson repeat louder. When the lights dim and the room empties, let one truth walk out with you. The measure of any nation is the distance it refuses to put between survival and dignity. The story closed that distance with paper, courage, and words that will not wear out. That is the action that matters after the action. That is the quiet that keeps breathing after the shouting stops. If you remember nothing else, remember the boundary. Protect life. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.